He had always believed that the boulder at the edge of his field was just an ordinary stone. But after a lightning strike, a crack appeared and cold air began to flow from inside. When the farmer finally went down, he realized that something had been hidden beneath his land for decades. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. The storm arrived without ceremony the way the worst ones always did, with a subtle darkening of the western sky that felt less like a threat and more like an omen. By late evening, the air over Elijah Brooks's farm had thickened into a heavy, restless blanket that pressed against the windows and crept into his lungs with every breath. He had lived on this land his entire life, inherited it from a father who had inherited it from a grandfather who had once been born into bondage and later clawed his way toward freedom through nothing but labor and stubborn hope. Elijah knew storms. He knew the rhythm of wind through corn, the sound rain made when it was only rain and not yet a weapon. But this night was different. The wind did not sing through the fields. It screamed. Sheets of rain lashed the house, turning the tin roof into a drum beaten by invisible hands. Thunder did not roll in distant waves, but cracked overhead like a splitting tree, close enough that the glass in the kitchen windows rattled in their frames. Elijah lay awake in his bed, eyes open in the dark, counting the seconds between flashes and thunderclaps, trying to measure how near the lightning was striking, knowing full well that it was closer than he liked to admit. Every violent gust made the walls groan, and every groan carried with it the memory of past years when storms like this one had cost him crops, fencing, sometimes entire seasons of work. Outside, water poured down the slope behind the old barn, a narrow trickle that became a raging channel within minutes, carving paths into the soil that Elijah had spent weeks preparing for spring planting. He imagined the top layer of earth being stripped away, imagined seeds washing downhill into the woods, imagined the cost that would come with the dawn. Storms were not just weather to him, they were audits. They examined his life and his labor with ruthless precision and decided what he would be allowed to keep. Sometime after midnight, the wind reached a pitch that made it sound as though the land itself were crying out. A massive crack tore through the night, louder than any thunder before it, so sharp and immediate that Elijah sat upright in bed, heart hammering, convinced for a moment that something on his property had been struck directly. The sound was followed by a deep, resonant boom that did not fade quickly, but lingered, echoing through the ground like a distant explosion. Then the storm swallowed it, burying it beneath rain and wind until there was no telling where it had come from or what it had touched. By dawn, the worst had passed, leaving behind a gray, exhausted silence that felt almost sacred after the violence of the night. Elijah pulled on his boots and stepped outside, greeted by the smell of soaked earth and crushed leaves. Steam rose from the fields in thin, ghostly threads as the first pale sunlight filtered through a broken layer of clouds. Everywhere he looked, his farm was altered. Fence posts leaned at odd angles, some torn entirely from the ground. A century-old oak near the creek lay split in two, its massive roots exposed like ribs. The dirt road that led from his house toward the far fields had been erased in places, replaced by shallow rivers that still whispered with retreating water. He began his usual post-storm ritual, walking the perimeter of the property with a practiced eye, noting damage, mentally listing repairs that would cost time he could not afford to lose. His boots sank into mud that clung stubbornly to every step, forcing him to lift his feet higher than usual, a small but constant reminder that the land was not done exacting its toll. In the lower fields, the soil had been ripped open in long, jagged scars, channels gouged by the flood that had rushed downhill during the night. He paused there for a moment, kneeling to touch the exposed roots of young plants, feeling the fragility of them in his fingers, then stood again and kept walking. It was only when he reached the far corner of his property, where the fields tapered off into a thin line of scrub trees and undergrowth, that he noticed something he could not immediately explain. For as long as he could remember, a massive boulder had rested there, half buried in the earth, a dull gray monument left behind by ancient glaciers long before any of his people had ever set foot on this soil. Children had climbed it, goats had used it as shade, and Elijah himself had leaned against it more than once when the heat made the air shimmer. It had always been there, unchanging, indifferent to the passing of generations. Now it was broken. From a distance, the boulder looked as though it had been struck by an enormous blade. A dark line ran from its crown to its base, perfectly vertical, splitting the stone in two. As Elijah approached, the scale of the damage became clearer. The crack was not a hairline fracture, but a yawning wound, wide enough near the bottom to swallow his hand. Fresh stone glittered along its edges, pale against the weathered surface of the rest of the rock, as if the heart of the boulder had been laid bare in a single night. He stood there for a long moment, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat, trying to make sense of it. He had heard the crack in the night. He was sure of it now. Whatever had made that sound had found its mark here. When he stepped closer, he felt it before he understood it. A thin stream of cold air flowed steadily from the darkness between the split halves, brushing against his skin like a breath. The air smelled wrong, not like wet stone or fresh earth, but like something older, stagnant, touched with the faint sourness of decay. He crouched and peered into the gap, shining his small flashlight into the depths. The beam was swallowed almost immediately, revealing only a suggestion of smoothness where he had expected jagged stone. The longer he looked, the more the shape of the darkness troubled him. The interior did not seem chaotic or natural. There was a flatness to one side, a hint of a corner where no corner should exist. His fingers traced the edge of the crack, and he realized with a jolt that the surface was too regular. Stone, fractured by lightning, should splinter, crumble, fall away in irregular shards. This was different. This was clean, as if the boulder had not simply been broken, but had been split along a line of weakness deliberately carved long ago. Elijah worked for over an hour clearing away the mud and roots that had been thrown across the opening by the storm. Each handful of debris he removed made the shape behind it more defined, until finally he could see that the darkness was not just a void, but an opening. The faint outline of a step emerged at the base of the crack, its edge rounded by time but unmistakably shaped by human hands. A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the cold air drifting up from below. He straightened slowly, looking around as though he expected someone to be watching, though he knew there was no one for miles. The storm had not just damaged his land. It had revealed something that had been hidden beneath it, something that his family had walked past for generations without ever knowing it was there. He fetched a shovel from the barn and returned to the boulder, widening the opening just enough to see more of the step, then another beneath it. They descended into the earth at a shallow angle, disappearing into the gloom. He tested the air again with a lighter, holding the flame close to the crack. It flickered but did not die, and the knowledge that there was oxygen below did little to calm him. By the time he finally stepped back from the opening, the gray morning had brightened into full daylight. The storm clouds were retreating eastward, leaving behind a sky that was deceptively calm. Elijah wiped his hands on his jeans and stared at the ancient rock that had guarded its secret so faithfully until lightning itself had torn it open. He did not go down then. He could not. The weight of the discovery pressed too heavily on him a sense that whatever lay beneath that boulder was not meant to be stumbled upon by accident. He marked the area with bright tape from his truck, making sure no wandering animal or curious neighbor would blunder into it, then turned back toward his house. As he walked, the farm around him seemed altered in ways he could not fully articulate. The damage from the storm was still there, raw and undeniable, but now it felt secondary, like the aftermath of a battle whose true significance lay hidden beneath the ground. He knew that the next step would carry him beyond the life he had always known and into a history that had been buried so deeply it had taken the violence of the heavens to unseal it. Elijah did not sleep that night. Not really. He lay in his bed with the windows open to the damp morning air, listening to the soft chorus of frogs and insects that had returned after the storm, trying to convince himself that what he had seen beneath the split boulder could wait another day. Yet, every time he closed his eyes, he saw again the unnatural straightness of that crack, the suggestion of stone shaped by hands long gone. The farm had always been his responsibility, his burden and his refuge, but now it felt as though it were watching him, waiting for him to return to the far corner where the land itself had opened its mouth. At first light he rose, packed a small bag with bottled water, a coil of rope, a pair of work gloves, and 2 flashlights with fresh batteries. He hesitated at the door, looking back at the familiar interior of his house, the scuffed table, the photographs of his parents on the wall, and felt an inexplicable sense of leaving something behind that he might not return to in the same way. Then he stepped out and made his way across the fields toward the waiting stone. The boulder looked even more wounded in the clear morning light, the crack casting a narrow blade of shadow across the wet grass. Elijah knelt and began again to clear away the debris that the storm had piled around the opening, moving slowly, mindful that the earth could still be unstable. The smell from below seemed stronger now, a blend of damp clay, old wood, and something faintly metallic. When he brushed his fingers along the inner edge of the crack, the surface felt smooth, worn not by water but by the passage of countless hands. He widened the opening just enough to slip his shoulders through, then tied one end of the rope to the hitch on his truck and let the other coil at his feet. He tested the first visible step with the toe of his boot. It held. The second was the same, solid stone packed with centuries of dirt. With a deep breath, he lowered himself into the gap, letting the cool air wrap around him, carrying with it the silence of a place untouched by the world above. The stairs descended at a gentle angle, shallow enough that he could walk rather than climb, yet narrow enough that his shoulders brushed the walls on either side. His flashlight beam glided over the stone, revealing tool marks that were faint but undeniable, grooves cut in parallel lines that spoke of deliberate effort. Water dripped somewhere ahead, each drop echoing softly, and the sound of his own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. After several yards, the stairway bent sharply to the left, the turn so abrupt that the opening to the surface vanished from view behind him. He paused there, heart pounding, struck by the realization that whoever had built this passage had not wanted a straight line from top to bottom. The bend was a simple trick, but an effective one, hiding the entrance from anyone who might manage to peer inside. It was a reminder that secrecy had once been essential here. Beyond the turn, the tunnel narrowed, forcing Elijah to angle his body sideways. At one point, he felt his boot brush against a thin wire stretched low across the passage. He froze, then gently traced it with his gloved fingers until he found its end, twisted into a small metal loop affixed to the wall. A bell, perhaps, long since lost to rust and time, would once have hung there, ready to ring at the slightest disturbance. Even now, in its broken state, the trap was eloquent. It told him that those who used this place had lived in constant fear of being discovered. The passage opened into a small chamber, no larger than a pantry. The ceiling was low enough that he had to stoop, and the walls were streaked with soot. A rusted hook protruded from one side, and beneath it lay the corroded remains of a lantern base. Elijah imagined people pausing here, wiping rain from their clothes, checking their lights before proceeding further underground. The thought that this was a threshold rather than a destination made his pulse quicken. He returned to the surface briefly to fetch more batteries and to steady himself with a gulp of fresh air. When he descended again, he moved with greater purpose, following the main corridor as it widened slightly and led him deeper into the earth. The air grew cooler, steadier, and the smells shifted subtly from the raw dampness of the storm to something older, enclosed. The corridor forked after several minutes of careful walking. To the right, the passage dipped into a narrower chute cluttered with fallen stones, while to the left it broadened and bore the faintest trace of footprints preserved in dried mud. Elijah chose the left path, drawn by the signs of life it held. He stepped through a simple stone doorway into a room that stopped him in his tracks. Rows of wooden benches filled the space, their legs sunk into the packed earth floor, their surfaces worn smooth by use. Against the far wall, a rectangular patch of lighter stone marked where a board had once been mounted. The beam of his flashlight trembled as he took it all in. This was not a cellar. This was not a shelter. It was a classroom, hidden in the dark beneath his fields. He stood there in the silence, feeling the weight of the discovery settle over him, knowing that whatever had begun with a storm-split boulder had now carried him irrevocably beyond the simple concerns of his daily life and into a forgotten chapter of the world he thought he knew. Elijah remained standing in the doorway of the hidden classroom long after his flashlight had stopped shaking in his hand. The silence was so complete that it seemed to press against his ears, filling the space with the echoes of lives that had once animated this buried room. When he finally stepped inside, the floor yielded slightly beneath his boots, releasing a faint puff of dust that rose and settled like a breath exhaled after a century of restraint. The benches were arranged in neat rows, not with the rough randomness of storage furniture, but with the clear intention of order. Each bench was different in its details, cut from whatever wood had been available, yet they all faced the same wall, a wall that still bore the pale rectangular scar where a chalkboard or slate must once have hung. He moved slowly along the first row, trailing his fingers over the smoothed edges of the seats. Time had worn the wood into shallow hollows, the imprint of bodies that had leaned forward in concentration, small shoulders huddled together in the dark. On the floor beneath one bench, he found a fragment of chalk, worn down to a nub, its white surface stained brown by earth. The sight of it struck him harder than any of the more dramatic features of the place. Chalk was a tool of learning, simple and fragile, and yet here it lay, preserved in a chamber built to hide that very act from the world above. Beyond the main classroom, another opening led into a narrower room lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of age. Most were empty now, the wood crumbling at a touch, but a few still held the relics of their former purpose. There were tattered primers with covers made from repurposed paper sacks, their pages stiff with mildew but still legible in places. He recognized passages from the Bible, arithmetic problems penciled into margins, lines of the alphabet traced and retraced until the paper tore under the pressure of uncertain hands. Some of the notebooks were nothing more than loose leaves stitched together with thread. The holes irregular, the binding done in haste, yet the care with which they had been kept was evident in the way they had been wrapped in cloth before being stored. In the corner of the room stood a small crate containing several glass bottles stoppered with cork. Elijah lifted one gently and held it to the light. The residue inside was dark and sticky, smelling faintly of berries and smoke. Homemade ink, he realized, made from whatever could be found, precious enough to be hoarded in this damp underground sanctuary. Nearby lay the rusted remnants of quill pens and broken pencils, their erasers long gone, their tips blunted by use. He tried to imagine the children who had used them, bending low over their work to make the most of every scrap of writing material. The deeper he went, the more personal the space became. In a third room, he found smaller benches, crudely built and uneven, as if sized for younger students. Beneath one of them was a child's shoe, its leather cracked and its laces missing, preserved only because no one had ever come back to claim it. He knelt there, holding it in his palm, struck by the intimacy of the object. It was one thing to uncover architecture, another to touch something that had been part of a living child's daily life. The rooms were connected by low corridors that forced him to stoop, and in those passages he noticed details that spoke of deliberate planning. Cloth had been tacked to the stone at the corners, remnants of efforts to soften sound. In several places, piles of rags lay heaped against the walls, their purpose clear when he brushed past them and felt how they muted the scrape of his jacket against the rock. This was a place designed for silence. At the far end of the complex he found what could only have been the teacher's room. It was smaller than the classrooms but better appointed, with a sturdy table and a chair that had once been upholstered. On the table lay a stack of papers bound with twine, and beside it a wooden box that had been carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Elijah hesitated before opening it, suddenly aware that he was not just exploring abandoned rooms, but intruding upon a story that had been intentionally sealed away. He carried the box back to the main classroom and sat on one of the benches, the weight of the wood pressing into his thighs, grounding him in the reality of the space. When he lifted the lid, he found inside a collection of letters, attendance lists, lesson plans, and personal notes, each page written in a hand that was both careful and hurried. Names leapt out at him, dozens of them, some accompanied by simple marks indicating progress or absence. He recognized a few surnames, families that still lived in the county, people he had known all his life, without ever realizing that their ancestors had once descended into this darkness in search of something as basic as literacy. As he read, the shape of the place grew clearer in his mind. This had not been a single secret class, but a sustained effort, organized and maintained over years. There were references to schedules, to supplies that had to be procured quietly, to routes that were safe and those that were not. One note, written in a tighter script than the rest, mentioned a night when lessons had been canceled because strangers had been seen near the old oak at the creek. The caution in that single sentence resonated through the chamber, a reminder that every act of teaching here had been an act of defiance. Elijah sat there until his flashlight dimmed, the beam narrowing to a dull glow that barely illuminated the words on the page. When he finally stood and made his way back toward the surface, the rooms seemed to close in behind him, not in menace but in quiet resignation, as though they had waited a lifetime to be seen and were now content to rest once more in the knowledge that someone had remembered. Elijah carried the wooden box with him when he climbed back to the surface, cradling it against his chest as though it were fragile in a way that had nothing to do with age or paper. The daylight felt harsh after the dim stillness of the underground rooms, and for a moment he had to shield his eyes against the brightness. The farm lay before him, scarred by the storm, yet unchanged in its essence, a world that had continued on oblivious to what had been preserved beneath it. He stood beside the split boulder for a long time, the cool air still brushing his legs, trying to reconcile the ordinary landscape with the extraordinary weight of what he now held. He did not open the box again until he was seated at his kitchen table, its surface cleared of the usual clutter of tools and receipts. The house was silent, and he found himself listening for sounds that were no longer there: the muffled drip of water underground, the echo of his own footsteps in the tunnels. When he finally lifted the lid, the smell of old paper drifted up, musty and faintly sweet, like the inside of a long-neglected church. He began with the letters, unfolding each one carefully, aware that the paper might crumble under careless hands. The handwriting was varied, some bold and confident, others tentative, letters pressed too hard into the page as though the writer feared the words might slip away if not anchored with force. The earliest dates were from the late 1870s, the ink faded but still legible. They spoke of gathering students quietly, of the constant worry that someone would talk, of the necessity of keeping everything hidden beneath the guise of ordinary farm work. One letter mentioned a new route through the trees that had to be used after a group of men had been seen lingering near the main road. Another described the joy of seeing a child read aloud for the first time, the moment framed not as triumph, but as a victory wrested from an unforgiving world. The attendance lists were meticulously kept, names aligned in narrow columns, each entry marked with small symbols indicating presence, lateness, or absence. Beside some names were notes written in the margins, reminders to bring more paper, to find a way to replace a broken lamp, to check on a student who had not returned in weeks. Elijah recognized several surnames and felt a jolt of recognition each time. These were not distant ancestors from some abstract history. These were the grandparents of people he still saw at the feed store, the church, the gas station on the edge of town. As he read deeper, patterns emerged. Lessons were often held late at night or in the early hours before dawn. Supplies were scarce, and there were frequent references to improvisation, to making ink from crushed berries and soot, to erasing and reusing paper until it tore. Yet there was also a stubborn consistency to the records, a determination that defied the fragility of the enterprise. They had kept teaching even when it was dangerous, even when it was exhausting, even when it would have been easier to stop. Tucked beneath the letters lay a small bundle of maps, their edges worn thin. They depicted the surrounding area with an intimacy that no official chart could match. Trees were marked not by species, but by the safety they offered: a crooked maple that hid the path from the road, a fallen pine that provided cover when the moon was bright. Several routes converged on the same point, the boulder on Elijah's land, drawn in a faint pencil as nothing more than a shaded oval. To anyone else it would have meant nothing, but now he understood that it had been the silent hub of an entire network. The most unsettling documents were the ones that spoke in code, Phrases that seemed innocuous at first glance took on new meaning when he read them in sequence. A note about spoiled milk, repeated across several weeks, was in fact a warning about increased patrols. A cheerful remark about church picnics concealed an instruction to cancel classes until further notice. The language of everyday life had been bent and reshaped into a shield against discovery. Toward the bottom of the box, he found a thin journal wrapped in oilcloth. The cover bore no title, only a pressed leaf, now brittle and brown. Inside, the entries were more personal, written by a single hand that combined resolve with weariness. The writer spoke of fear, not in grand terms, but in the small details that accumulate until they become unbearable. The creak of a gate at the wrong hour, the knowledge that a single careless word could undo years of work. One passage described a night when someone failed to arrive, when the waiting had stretched so long that the class had been dismissed in silence. The next entry, written weeks later, mentioned that the missing person would not be returning. The final pages were the hardest to read. They spoke of mounting pressure, of rumors that could no longer be ignored, of a decision to hide the archive and close the school until it was safe again. There was no declaration of hope, no promise of return. The last line ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence, the ink blotted as though the writer's hand had been jarred or forced to stop. Elijah closed the journal and sat back, feeling as though he had been listening to a voice that had spoken for a century in the dark and had finally fallen silent in his hands. The storm that had split the boulder seemed now like a cruel coincidence, a reminder that history does not always wait for permission to surface. He knew then that this discovery was not his to keep. It had been hidden for reasons that were both tragic and profound, but now that it had been revealed, it demanded witnesses beyond the walls of his kitchen. He photographed each page, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest, and made notes about the location of every room and artifact underground. When he finally reached for his phone, he hesitated only long enough to consider the consequences of the call he was about to make. The farm would never again be just a farm. The past had been given a door, and he had been the one to open it. The first trucks rolled onto Elijah's land 2 days after he made the call, their tires cutting deep tracks through soil that was still soft from the storm. He stood on the porch and watched them approach, a convoy of ordinary-looking vehicles that nevertheless carried the weight of something extraordinary within them. Until that moment, the discovery beneath the boulder had belonged to him alone, shared only with the ghosts whose words he had read by the light of his kitchen lamp. Now it was stepping out into the open world, and he felt the shift as keenly as if the ground beneath his feet were moving. They introduced themselves with professional calm, but their eyes betrayed their excitement as soon as he led them to the far corner of the field. The split stone loomed there like a wound that refused to close, the bright edges of the fracture still stark against the older gray surface. They circled it slowly, taking measurements, photographing the crack from every angle, testing the stability of the earth around it before any of them dared to peer inside. One of them crouched and placed a hand at the edge of the opening, letting the cold air wash over his skin, and nodded to the others with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knows he is standing at the threshold of a story that will rewrite familiar narratives. The property was soon transformed by tape and temporary markers, the invisible boundaries of Elijah's daily life replaced by a grid of caution. Where he had once driven his truck without thinking, he now had to weave around labeled stakes and warning signs. A portable generator hummed into existence beside the boulder, feeding power to lights and instruments that made the hidden entrance glow like a stage. The underground passage was shored up with wooden supports, each beam placed with care to prevent the collapse of walls that had endured in silence for more than 100 years. They worked slowly, reverently, as though they were afraid to startle the past back into hiding. Each object was documented before it was touched, every scrap of paper coaxed from the earth with tools designed for gentleness rather than speed. Elijah watched as they lifted the box of letters he had found, now sealed in a clear protective case, its contents illuminated under sterile light. The mundane details of his discovery were becoming data, transformed into numbered entries in a ledger that would travel far beyond the borders of his farm. As the days passed, the small group of specialists grew. A conservationist arrived to oversee the handling of the paper, her hands moving with a precision that bordered on tenderness. A geologist examined the boulder itself, tracing the line of the fracture, explaining that lightning alone could not have produced such a clean split unless the stone had already been weakened by an internal structure. The implication was clear. The rock had been hollowed, shaped from within long before the storm had ever struck it. News traveled faster than any of them expected. By the end of the week, reporters were parking along the road, their cameras pointed toward the fields. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the marked perimeter, whispering to one another, trying to reconcile the quiet familiarity of Elijah's farm with the headlines that were already beginning to circulate. He heard his name spoken in tones that ranged from awe to suspicion, and he felt the curious isolation that comes with being both at the center of attention and utterly alone. The historians began to cross-reference the names from the attendance lists with records pulled from county archives and church registries. When they brought Elijah the first results, he recognized the surnames immediately, people whose descendants still lived within a few miles of his house. The discovery was no longer abstract. It had reached out into the living community, binding the present to the past with threads that could not be ignored. One afternoon, a woman arrived who introduced herself as the great-granddaughter of a man whose name had appeared repeatedly in the journal. She stood at the edge of the boulder with tears in her eyes, clutching a faded photograph of her ancestor, a man who had never spoken of how he had learned to read. Elijah realized then that the hidden school was not just an academic revelation, it was a restoration, a return of stolen stories to the families who had carried their absence for generations. As the investigation deepened, so did the scrutiny. Officials from the State Heritage Office came to evaluate the site, speaking in measured tones about preservation and public interest. There were discussions about fencing, about liability, about how the land might be accessed in the future. Elijah listened with a growing knot in his stomach, aware that the ground beneath his feet was being claimed by forces larger than himself. Yet, for all the bureaucracy, there was also a sense of quiet wonder that pervaded the work. Late one evening, when most of the crew had left, Elijah found one of the younger researchers still seated in the underground classroom, her head bent over a ledger, the light of her lamp casting long shadows across the benches. She looked up when he approached and said only that she had never seen anything like this before. He did not need more than that. The place spoke for itself. The past week had taught him that once history surfaces, it cannot be reburied. The storm had cracked more than stone. It had split open a silence that had endured for more than a century, and now that silence was being filled with voices, names, and memories that refused to be contained. Elijah returned to his house that night, knowing that the story of his land had already outgrown him, yet bound to him in ways he could never have anticipated. The work on Elijah's land settled into a strange rhythm, part research expedition, part vigil. Trucks arrived each morning and departed each evening, carrying with them containers filled with fragments of a buried world, while the fields around the boulder continued their quiet routines of growth and decay. Yet, beneath that rhythm ran a deeper current, one that was no longer about measurements and catalog numbers, but about the lives that had once converged under that stone. The historians no longer spoke of the site only in terms of chambers and artifacts. They spoke of people. Through the careful piecing together of the journals, letters, church records, and census data, a picture began to emerge of how the underground school had truly functioned. It was not a single heroic effort, not the work of one brave teacher acting alone, but a network sustained by an entire community. Mothers had memorized the safest times to slip away from their cabins. Older children had been tasked with watching the roads and the tree lines, ready to signal if unfamiliar figures appeared. Routes were planned and replanned as the seasons changed, as leaves fell and the cover of darkness grew thinner, as snow made footsteps visible where before they had been swallowed by mud. The lessons themselves had been shaped by necessity. The journals described classes that lasted no more than an hour at a time, sometimes cut short when the wind carried unfamiliar sounds down the tunnel. Children were taught to read not through leisurely study but through relentless repetition, tracing letters until their hands cramped, reciting passages under their breath because speaking too loudly could carry beyond the cloth mufflers tacked to the walls. Arithmetic was framed in the language of survival, numbers taught through examples drawn from market prices and crop weights, because literacy here was not a luxury, but a tool that might one day allow a person to navigate a world that had been designed to keep them ignorant. The teachers, too, came into focus. Some were itinerant preachers who traveled from county to county under the guise of holding prayer meetings, their satchels filled not only with Bibles but with smuggled primers. Others were local men and women who had themselves learned to read in secret and now risked everything to pass that knowledge on. One name appeared again and again, often accompanied by notes of gratitude and concern. She had organized schedules, procured supplies, mediated disputes within the community, and, when danger threatened, decided whether to cancel lessons or move them to an alternative site. Her handwriting filled the margins of the journal with a mixture of stern reminders and gentle encouragements, and it was in her final unfinished entry that the sense of impending collapse was most keenly felt. The dangers that had haunted the school were not abstract. The coded references in the letters were gradually deciphered, revealing patterns of surveillance and harassment that had surrounded the underground effort from its inception. Patrols were not merely rumors, but organized groups who believed they were defending the social order. Names of men known for violence appeared obliquely in the margins, never written in full, but marked with symbols that those within the network would have recognized instantly. There were mentions of cabins burned in the night, of families who vanished from the records entirely, leaving behind only a blank space where their names should have been. Elijah found himself drawn especially to the stories of the students. One boy, no more than 10 when he first appeared in the attendance lists, had progressed from barely forming letters to reading whole paragraphs within 2 years. A note in the margin, beside his name, spoke of his delight in discovering that he could read the labels on sacks at the general store. Later, entries mentioned that he had stopped attending after his family moved north, following a rumor of work that paid in real wages rather than credit. His path could be traced no further in the records, but the mere existence of that note suggested a life redirected by knowledge gained in a room no wider than a barn stall. There were darker threads as well. A teenage girl, whose name appeared consistently for months, vanished from the lists without explanation. In a later letter, written in code, there was a brief mention of a closed door and a road that cannot be taken again. The historians debated the meaning, but Elijah did not need an academic consensus to feel the weight of it. He had grown up with stories like that, half told and quickly silenced, the knowledge that some losses were never formally acknowledged, only carried in the spaces between words. As the narrative of the school took shape, so too did the realization that its end had been neither sudden nor entirely voluntary. Pressure had mounted gradually, a tightening noose that left fewer and fewer safe nights for gathering. Supplies became harder to secure. Routes that had once been reliable were compromised. In the final months recorded in the journal, classes were increasingly sporadic, the handwriting more hurried, the tone shifting from determination to triage. The decision to hide the archive and close the school had not been a retreat, but a last act of preservation, a way of ensuring that if the effort itself could not survive, its memory might. For Elijah, the academic reconstruction was inseparable from a more personal reckoning. His own family's stories, the ones he had grown up hearing around kitchen tables and church basements, took on new resonance in light of what was being uncovered beneath his fields. His grandfather had spoken of a time when books were kept out of sight, when learning had been something done quietly, almost shamefacedly, not because it was wrong, but because it was forbidden. Elijah had always assumed those stories belonged to some vague elsewhere, some distant plantation or forgotten town. Now he understood that they belonged here. The farm was no longer just the place where he had been raised. It was a crossroads of resistance, a site where ordinary people had taken extraordinary risks for the sake of their children's minds. That knowledge weighed on him, especially as he faced increasing pressure from outside interests. Developers began to inquire about the possibility of building a visitor center. Local officials debated the economic potential of the discovery, while some longtime residents expressed discomfort, muttering that old wounds were being reopened unnecessarily. Elijah listened to all of it, then returned each evening to the Boulder, walking its perimeter as though it were a grave marker. He knew now that the land he tended was layered with meaning that went far beyond soil quality or crop yields. It carried the imprint of those who had walked it in fear and hope, who had carved out a hidden refuge beneath it when the world above offered none. When he finally made the decision to stand as the site's guardian rather than its seller, it felt less like a choice than a recognition of responsibility. The storm had revealed more than history. It had given him a role in its telling. The farm no longer woke in silence. Where Elijah had once risen with the sun to the private sounds of birds and wind in the corn, he now heard the distant rumble of arriving vehicles and the murmur of voices drifting across the fields. The storm that had cracked the ancient boulder felt impossibly far away, yet its consequences shaped every step he took. The site was officially recognized as a place of historical importance, and with that recognition came forms, inspections, rules that told him where he could drive his truck and where the soil was no longer his to disturb. Wooden walkways were laid down to protect the fragile ground around the entrance, their pale boards standing out against the dark earth like a scar of a different kind. At first, he resented the changes. The farm had been his sanctuary, a place where he answered to seasons and livestock rather than committees. Now it belonged in part to the state, to scholars, to families who came searching for names they had never expected to find, carved into the margins of an old notebook. He watched them arrive in small groups, often hesitant, their faces marked by a mixture of curiosity and reverence. Some knelt by the boulder as though it were an altar, tracing the split in the stone with trembling fingers. Others stood back, uncertain, as though afraid that touching the past might somehow claim them in return. The first public gathering was held in late summer, when the fields were tall and green, and the air carried the promise of harvest. A simple tent was raised near the edge of the restricted zone, its canvas walls flapping gently in the breeze. Elijah stood at the back as names were read aloud from the recovered attendance lists, each one spoken with care, each one met by the quiet murmur of recognition or disbelief. It was not a ceremony of grand speeches or political declarations. It was an act of restoration, a return of voices to people who had learned to live without them. Among the crowd were descendants who had driven from other states after seeing reports in the news. They brought with them fragments of family history, photographs, letters, stories that had never quite made sense until now. One man showed Elijah a worn book that his grandmother had kept hidden in a false bottom drawer, its margins filled with cramped notes written in a hand that matched one of the names from the journal. A woman wept openly as she described how her father had insisted that education was the only inheritance worth fighting for, though he had never said where he himself had learned to read. The underground school was no longer an academic discovery. It was a living bridge between generations. With the recognition came offers. A regional tourism board proposed a visitor center complete with a gift shop and parking lot. A private foundation suggested purchasing a portion of the land to ensure its protection, their representatives speaking smoothly about long-term sustainability. Even some local officials hinted that the story might be more palatable if it were framed as a general tale of perseverance rather than as a pointed reminder of specific injustices. Elijah listened to them all, his face impassive, feeling the old tug of practicality that had guided him through lean years on the farm. The money would be useful. The attention might even secure his family's future. Yet each time he descended into the preserved chambers with the researchers, each time he saw the careful way they handled the fragile pages, he was reminded of why the place had existed at all. It had not been built for profit or recognition. It had been built because people had believed that the simple act of learning to read was worth risking everything. To reduce it to a commodity felt like a second erasure. He made his decision quietly, turning down the more lucrative proposals and working instead with a small coalition of historians and community leaders to establish the site as an educational center rather than an attraction. There would be no neon signs, no souvenir mugs bearing the image of the Boulder. Visitors would come by appointment, guided through the story with context and care. The aim was not to dazzle, but to teach, to let the quiet power of the place speak for itself. In the evenings, after the last car had departed and the farm settled once more into a semblance of peace, Elijah walked the perimeter of the restricted area. The boulder loomed in the fading light, its split now reinforced by discrete supports that held the two halves apart just enough to preserve the entrance. He often thought of the last person who had stood there before him, the one who had hidden the archive and sealed the chambers, knowing that the world was not ready to hear their story. That person had left without knowing whether the sacrifice would matter. Elijah lived with the answer every day. One autumn afternoon, as the first leaves began to fall, he returned alone to the main classroom. The benches were still, the air cool and dry, thanks to the conservation measures now in place. On the wall, where the chalkboard had once hung, a faint white smear remained, too delicate to erase. He stood before it and imagined the hand that had made it, the effort it had taken to form a letter in a place where letters were forbidden. The thought filled him with a sense of continuity that was almost painful in its intensity. When he climbed back to the surface, the sun was low over the fields, painting the farm in gold. He understood then that the land he worked would never be merely soil and crop again. It was a repository of memory, a testament to resilience that had waited patiently beneath his feet until the storm had given it a voice. He had not sought out this role, but it had found him all the same, and he accepted it with the quiet resolve of someone who knows that the past, once uncovered, is not a burden to be shed, but a trust to be honored. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe now so you won't miss the next chapter and the other investigations coming to this channel. Share this video with someone who loves real mysteries, and let these forgotten stories reach the people who need to hear them.